walked into Heathrow, the police, like everybody gathered, lethal weapons. Anyway, they're up here in my study, my proud legacy of Houston Medical Halacha seminar that we had. So thank you very much for this invitation, this opportunity. As I always say, it's always a pleasure to teach Americans how to speak English. Let me say that I can see a few people on my screen, and obviously it's easier speaking to people you can see. So if you have your makeup on, you can show yourself. Of course, I'm not personally offended if you don't. But if I see you, at least I can know that I'm registering some response. Let me just ask you to raise a hand or type me a chat if you can hear me clearly. Can you do that? Okay. I've been asked to talk a little bit about free will. And so that's a basic, maybe the most basic of all Jewish subjects or spiritual subjects. Let's try to work through this a little bit together in the time that we have. I know it's a deep and heavy subject for a Sunday morning, and I know our minds are occupied with many weighty things and tragedies that have befallen us in general over the last few months, and this week in particular. Hard to wrench our minds away from that. But let's, in the merit of the people who need healing, in the merit of Dr. Gordon Sack, an old contact from many years ago, Gershon Ben Sipori should have a full shleim and be well. Let's, for the merit of everyone who needs it, put our heads into a bit of Torah study and see if we can make some progress. So let's take a look at the subject of free will. I'll try to give you an authentic Jewish overview of the subject and provide you some food for thought. And I hope this makes a difference to your conception of this subject and of Torah in general. Free will, what we call Bechira. By the way, I wrote a book about this recently. Let me show you the book. Nothing wrong with a little shameless self-promotion. So that's called Will, Freedom, and Destiny. And this book is available in a few languages, and you're very welcome to email me. I'm sure you can get a copy in Houston. If not, email me. I'll do my best to get you a copy. And that book will give you an overview of the subject. In fact, I just published that book in Hebrew. And if you're interested in the sources, the Hebrew book has the same text as the English, but at the back of the book, it has all the original sources. So you want to see what the Rambam says and the Ralbag and Rabbi Kreskas and all our great classic authorities over the centuries. I've actually printed out their relevant sections so you can actually read and learn the original material in that book. And for those of you whose Hebrew is good enough, you'd like to see the original sources, I hope you'd enjoy that book. But what I'd like to do in this session is give you an overview of some of the challenge of this subject and some of its fascination. I know that Houston Jews are America's intellectual black belts, so I'm sure we can deal with this at a high level. First of all, I'm sure you know that free will is the basic axiom on which the human being is built. That has to be clear, and it has to be understood how fundamental that is. What's unique about the human being, not Jews, I'm talking about humans, before we get to any Jewish questions, is that we are free agents, we have free will. The classic way this is expressed in Torah sources is that God made the human being in his image. We call that Tselem Elokim. And our classic sources, the Sforno, for example, and Meshech Chochmah, they ask, what does it mean to be created in God's image? How do you imagine that? How do you construe that? And the answer is free will. There are only 2 points of freedom in the system. God does whatever he wants, unconstrained by any limitations, and we. Nothing besides a human being has free will. Angels are too high. They see too clearly to have free will. And animals are too low. They see only the earthy, material, sensual, materialistic, and therefore they have no free will. Amazingly, we have free will as human beings because we are sandwiched at the interface between an angelic world above us, which is too high for free will, and an animal world below us, which is too low. The kind of free will that angels have, according to Kabbalistic teaching, angels have free will like you have free will to walk into a fire. Could you walk into a fire? Yeah. Would you? No. Do you have free will to jump off a tall building? Yeah. Would you do it? No. You see yourself becoming part of the scenery, so clearly you wouldn't do it. And amazingly and paradoxically, we have free will because we're able to be confused. The clearer you see reality, the less choice you have. So human beings are pitched at the interface between an angelic world above us and an animal world below. We feel the pull towards the noble, the elevated, the conscience-driven, the refined, and also the pull towards the lecherous and the material and the earthy. And in that zone of tension is our free will. And therefore, that's what's unique about us. We're pitched above the animal and below the angelic, and we feel the pull in both directions, and that zone of tension is our free will. Here's a very beautiful way to say it. I think an exquisitely beautiful way to say it. The Medrash says that when God created a human being, he said, Na'aseh Adam. That means let us create the human. And the obvious question the Medrash asks is, why would God express himself in the plural? Let us make man. Let us make the human being. There's one thing we fixated on in Judaism. It is that God is one. Why would he express himself in the plural? And the Medrash has a list of fascinating answers to that question. But here's the one that's relevant for now. Before God created the human being, he consulted his angelic energies. Let's call them the angels or the divine midot. In other words, the characteristics, projections of God himself that he wanted to construct into a human being. Justice and truth and mercy and kindness and charity. Some of those said yes and some said no. Some said create man and some said do not. Charity, Stocker said create man, he'll give charity. Truth said do not create a human being, he'll be full of lies. And these two factions became locked in an almighty irresolvable conflict. Some saying he should be created, and some saying he should not. And while they were arguing in this unresolved conflict, God created man. Now the misunderstanding, the immature understanding of that midrash is, since they could not resolve the issue, God ignored them and created the human being. That's wrong. The correct understanding is God asked for their advice and he took it. What was their advice? An almighty unresolved conflict, and that's what God created. Right? That's the sophisticated message that this midrash is telling you. What God created was the battle between angelic forces. Those that pull us in the right direction, those that pull us in the wrong direction, and it's resolving that battle which is the definition of the human being. And therefore, in case you think you're created to be serene and peaceful and chill, that's not the Jewish idea. You're not here to chill. You're here to feel the tension of moral choice and resolve that tension correctly. So far, so good. Can we continue? Yes? Okay. So the basic principle on which the human being is constructed is the ability to choose morally. That's what defines us, and that's what we're here for. We're here to choose good. That's what we're here for. Now, our free will is seriously limited. It's limited, I would say, metaphorically, horizontally and vertically. Horizontally, I mean that when you look through all the areas of your life, your financial status, your academic situation, your marital status, your health situation, it's axiomatic in Jewish thinking that you are free in only one of those zones. Free will applies classically in Judaism only in one area of your life. Which area is that? The answer is only in the moral zone, ethical and moral. You are free to be good or bad. The rest is all ancillary. For example, let's take money. Are you free to be wealthy? Can you choose that? We have a deep principle in Judaism that on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the year every year, is predetermined and predecided. Every last cent you will earn that year, the coming year. There's nothing you can do that change that dispensation, okay? Because it's not a moral issue. You can ruin yourself financially without limit. You can destroy yourself financially. That's immoral, irresponsible, and it's a failure of choice. And that you can do. But you cannot guarantee wealth. No matter what you do, you cannot earn 1 penny more than the maximum that is being predetermined for you that year. By the way, I don't think you need me to tell you this. Look around the world, you will see people who are very smart, always make the right decisions, and never earn any money, and others who are total idiots and very rich. I happen to know a few, I can assure you. So, there's no correlation, okay, between those two at all. And therefore, I saw a very interesting interview with Mr. Bronfman. Bronfman is a Canadian Jew. He owns one half of Canada. There's another Jew who owns the other half. But anyway, Mr. Bronfman is a multi-zillionaire. He owns half of Canada. So the interviewer said, Mr. Bronfman, how did you become so rich? He said, when I was 10 years old, I bought an apple for 1 cent and I sold it for 2 cents. Then I bought 2 apples and I sold them for 4 cents. Then I bought a box of apples and sold them for $1. Then my grandfather died and left me $61 million. And that's how I became rich. Now, that is a correct Jewish perception. You make your effort, but that's irrelevant to the outcome. And that is an authentic Jewish understanding, is that we are not in the world to choose wealth. You need to pursue it in a sensible fashion because it's an important tool, but only fulfilling an obligation that we call ishtadlus, you do not actually affect a result. Let's take another example, right? I see at least a couple of doctors on this group. You don't need to be a doctor to know that your health is not subject to your choice. You can make all the right health moves and become disastrously ill. It happens all the time, I can assure you. You can destroy your health without limit. You could kill yourself. You can do any amount of damage to your health because that's immoral. That's sinful. That's a transgression. And therefore, there's no limit amount how much you can harm yourself. You can be overweight, you can smoke, you can all kind of stuff, you can wreck your health. But you cannot guarantee good health, no matter how much you try, because that is beyond your choice, and therefore non-amenable to free will. Even marriage options, right? Even marriage options, you're limited. A young man cannot possibly explore a relationship with every woman on earth, even though I've met some young men who seriously try. But be that as it may, your marriage options are limited. And therefore, whether you're talking about all these peripheral issues in life, our teaching is that they're not, strictly speaking, amenable to free will. I'm giving a very broad outline here, but that's the general approach. What is amenable to your free will is how you handle those areas. Do you rise to the occasion and do the best you can morally, or do you allow yourself to slip and look down to the immature and the childish and the animalistic? And therefore, when we talk about free will in Judaism, we're not talking about which flavor dessert you're going to eat. It's true you make a selection. Which pair of socks you're going to wear in the morning. It's true you make selections, but those are not free will choices. Machines can be programmed to make those selections. Animals make choices like that. So it's important to know when we talk about Bechira, or free will in Judaism, we're talking about the choice to be good or bad. Okay, so far so good? Ladies, gentlemen? Okay, now here comes the most important point of this discussion. And if there's one thing to remember, it should be this. On a vertical scale, our free will is limited. And this is without question the most classic notion in this area of Jewish thought, and arguably the most classic notion in all of Jewish thinking. And that's called Nekudat HaBechira. If you'd like to look this up, again, you can look in my book, but the classic source for this is Rav Dessler, the great teacher of the last generation, who put it in this format. But once you've seen it clearly, you see it everywhere. And that is the notion of the point of free will, which means this, that on a vertical scale, in any area of our moral challenge, whether it's the male-female sensual challenge, whether it's the challenge of theft or doing something dishonest, whichever dimension of your life, there are moral choices in each of them is a vertical scale. And here comes the key. At any point in your life, you are free on one point on a vertical scale only. And that's where you're being stressed and tested. And that's where you must exert your free will. Points beneath that are so vulgar and crude and coarse and immature, you would never get them wrong. And so when you get them right, there's no credit. There's no effort and no growth in that. And points above that are so difficult and refined and professionally demanding that you wouldn't get them right. And when you fail, you're not held accountable because they're beyond your point of choice. Let me say that again. There's a vertical scale and you're operating at one point of refinement and difficulty on that scale. Beneath that point, things are easy, they're no challenge. Above that point, things are difficult, they're no challenge. You couldn't achieve that if you tried. God is testing you and holding you accountable where you're operating in life. Now, let me give you an example to make this as tangible as I can. Imagine, let's take the question of theft. Take the question of theft. Let's take the bottom of the scale. Here's a young fellow hanging out in the street, violently mugging little old ladies. That's what he does. That's what he does. Why he's doing that, how he got into that, we'll have to discuss. But that's where his reality is. Says Rabbi Dessler, when that young fellow mugs his next victim, if he decides that instead of killing her, he's only going to crack her skull, he has made a tremendous moral advance. He's performed a mitzvah that he will be rewarded for in the world to come. Now, to you, that's unthinkable. I mean, I don't know you all personally, but I presume that most days you're not hanging out in the park mugging little old ladies. Right? I presume not. If you're already Sunday morning listening to a Torah shir, probably that's not what you do on Sunday afternoon. So if that's where he's operating, to you, that violence is unthinkable. But at his level of moral development, for him, that's his ordeal. And all that can be expected of him is to overcome his relevant level at that point in his life. Is this clear? Am I making myself clear? Now, that means that everybody, each one of you on this webinar, each one of you is guilty of stealing at your level. For example, please raise your hand if you've ever had a job working for someone else. Anyone working for someone else? Okay. You're sitting there in the office working for someone and you call your mother. 2 counts of theft against you. One is your employer pays for the call. And the second is that 10 minutes you speak to your mother, you're being paid a salary to work. What do you mean you don't steal? You mean you don't hit people on the head with a brick in the street or break into people's houses at night with a black mask and a crowbar? But that's not where God's holding you accountable. And when you make that private call, now if you work in a city where it's tacitly accepted that you can make a private call, that's okay. But how about long distance? How about half an hour on the phone? How about coming a little late to work or leaving a little early or not working as hard as you could? That's theft. So when you look down on that individual in the street, you think you're superior to him. You may not be superior. He may be coping with his life situation better than you're coping with yours. This is a little scary. Let's take another level. Let's say you would never make a private call or walk out of the office with a little stationery or something like that. You'd never do that. How about a higher level called Gnevas Das? Gnevas Das means that if you mislead someone, listen carefully, in Jewish law, if you mislead someone in a way that is dishonest, even if no one's harmed at all, it's called theft of the mind, and it's culpable. Example, you visit someone in hospital, and on your way out, you notice someone else who's sick in the hospital that you did not know was ill. So you walk into the room and you say, I came specially to visit you. You're lying through your teeth. That's called, you did a mitzvah as well. That's another calculation. By the way, Jewish law requires that if you walk into the person's room and they say, thank you for coming to visit me specially, you do not have to disabuse them of that notion and upset them. And you don't have to say that. But you cannot mislead them in that situation. That's called Gnevas Das. You mislead somebody. Rabbi Jackson, I'm going to set your participants a little homework question. And here's a homework question. And for every correct answer, the rabbi's going to buy you a whiskey. Well, whatever you're into in Houston, I don't know, cocaine, I don't know what you're into these days. But anyway, here's the question. One of the rabbis in Israel was asked this question some time ago. A man walked into a bank in New York and he said to the bank manager, I want a bank loan. Manager said, yeah, we do loans. How much do you want? The guy said, I want $200. I'm going abroad for 3 months. I need $200. The manager said, are you serious? $200 is, you're going to pay 20% interest on that. I mean, are you serious? Guy said, yep, you advertise loans. So the manager pulled out the forms and they started filling them in. When they got to collateral, the manager said, well, what are you going to leave us as security for the loan? The guy said, my car's in your parking lot. Here are the keys. I'm going abroad. I don't need the car. My car's worth a lot more than $200. Impound my car. Hold the keys. If I fail to pay the loan when I come back, you sell my car, defray the loan. Manager said, great, absolutely acceptable. Guy took the loan, went abroad. 3 months later, walked back to the manager's office, paid $240 and left. Manager called him back and said, what was all that about? Guy said, where else could I get parking for 3 months for $40? Okay, now here's the question. Is that legitimate in Jewish law? On the one hand, total deception. On the other hand, he took a loan, he paid interest, he left value. That's a very interesting question. And I'll leave you to ponder it, and I hope it keeps you up all night tonight. But that is a level of spiritual, religious sophistication. If you told that story to the fellow on the street mugging people, he wouldn't see the problem. He'd think that's too obvious. Why didn't I think of that? You are being tested at your level. Do you know that in Jewish law, every word you say has a Jewish standard? Every word you ever say has to be completely true, completely kind, and completely necessary. Please raise your hand if every word you've ever said is completely true, completely kind, completely necessary. That's how high it gets. The question is, at what level of the scale are you operating on? If you're mugging people on the street, you're being judged at that level. If you're working in an office and considering an occasional private phone call, that's where you're being judged. And you cannot compare yourself to anyone else, because God's comparing you to your standard, not to somebody else. Any teachers among you? Any teachers? A teacher in a Jewish school should never read out the grades in a classroom. Absolutely not. Because when the teacher stands up in front of the class and reads out the grade, and some poor kid got a lesser grade than somebody else and feels like a failure, maybe he tried harder. That's not legitimate. That's the right reason for a test and a grade is for the teacher to say to the child in private, that grade's not good enough for you. But make the kid feel inadequate because he didn't get somebody else's grade is ridiculous. God doesn't compare you to other people. The Talmud says that when you die, all you see is what you are, stripped of all facade and illusion, and what you could have been. God doesn't compare you to other people. All you see is yourself. Actually, it's not 100% true, because husband and wife are bonded into each other forever. It's good news for some of us and a little distressing for others, but be that as it may. By the way, gentlemen.
Can I just say one quick thing real quick? And that is that we're kind of maxed out. So if you have friends that want to get on, just let them know it's on Facebook Live right now as well. They can go to Gabriel Jackson and just watch on the Facebook Live, or Bella Drew Degree. That's all. Sorry for the interruption. You
see, there's a limit to free will about joining things like webinars. Indeed, life's full of limitations to the free will. So your free will is limited according to your level of spiritual attainment. And in the world to come, God compares you to an image of what you could have been and what you are. He compare you to somebody else. And that's why you cannot judge yourself against anyone else. And students, school children should not be judged. Therefore, when kids are 15 years old and 16 and 17, you can be brutally unfair. Life's unfair, they have to learn. But not when they're 7 years old and don't understand that. Okay? And therefore, The standard of comparison is, and by the way, if you're a parent and you're raising children, the standard that should be applied to your children is when kids say to you, why do you get a bigger piece than me? Why is his bedtime different than mine? The answer is, in this house, each one gets what they need. You don't get the same. God doesn't give us all the same. God gives each of us what we need. So when your kids say to you, oh, it's not fair, you love him more than me. Why is he getting more? Why is he getting? The answer is, hey, buddy, you get what you need, and he gets what he needs. They don't give you the same. How are you coping with what you're given? That's the message. And therefore, Nukudas Bechira, in order to know how you are coping spiritually, what your genuine spiritual level is, you need to know where you're operating. Looking down on other people who achieve less than you, you might be making a big mistake. You know, it's very interesting. We like to compare ourselves to people in a way that makes us look good. We like to look at people that are wealthier than us and envy them, and look at people that are morally inferior and feel superior to them. That's exactly the wrong comparison. You should always look at people that are poorer than you and feel blessed, and look at people that are morally superior to you and envy them. But that's not the comparison that you like. So, but that's the concept. And therefore, this is the classic teaching of Nekudas HaBechira. Now, let's take one more step. This point of freedom is not static. Because when you make a free will decision correctly, you raise your point of freedom. And then God sends you a harder test. That's the way it works. When you overcome a test and you become a more powerful moral being, God sends you a harder test. It's more refined and more delicate, but more elevated and more powerful, but you're a more powerful warrior. And if you overcome that, you see, if it weren't this way, you'd outgrow free will. When you pick up weights in the gym and you build muscle, then you've got to pick up heavier weights. And therefore, the more righteous you are, the more God stresses you. The more accomplished you are spiritually, the more difficulty he gives you. Because you're a more mighty warrior, you've got to fight. Anyone there in Houston play tennis? Anybody? Tennis? Tennis is meaningful only against an opponent who's more or less on your level. That's tennis. When you play somebody way below you, that's not called tennis. Imagine you're a good club player, one of the best in your club. One day you walk out onto the court and you find you've been challenged by a 3-year-old. Kid walks on with his diaper and his racket, okay, let's say you win. Is that relevant? No. Technically speaking, you won, but it's irrelevant. On the other hand, let's say you play the world champion, and during the entire match, you never see the ball once. Would you go home and tell your mum you lost? No, you didn't lose. You didn't play. That's not tennis. Tennis is meaningful against somebody on your level. When you beat somebody beneath you, there's no challenge and no growth in that. That's not the game. And when you play somebody above your level and you lose, there's no disgrace in that. That's not called defeat. And when you play the people in your club and you can beat them, then you've got to play the other club champions. And when you beat those guys, you've got to play the national people. And when you beat them, you've got to play the international people. There's no limit to this. When you end up fighting in the world heavyweight division, if you win, there's $1 million in it. But if you lose, you get your jaw broken. And therefore, the notion of the point of free will is Rabbi Dessler's most memorable analogy. He says the point of free will is like two armies, two countries at war. The entire nations are at war, but the pain and conflict is felt only on the front line. That's where the battle's taking place. That's where the anguish and battle is taking. And as one country advances, conquered territory becomes quiet. There's no battle there anymore. I work in London at a Jewish outreach center. Like I'm sure you're all involved one way or another. Rabbi Jackman, other rabbis there in Houston, devoting their lives to trying to educate Jews and bring them in. So I work in a place like that. Imagine I'm working there. A young man walks in, Jewish man, and he starts learning and fascinated by his Judaism, was uneducated as a young Jew. 3 weeks later, he walks out of his office and he's going to cross the street for his lunch. And he's about to walk into the local seafood deli. Crab, boiled alive, shrimp. Today you can buy, chocolate-covered ants, cockroaches. I'm not kidding. Bad news, Jewishly. But he likes that stuff. Next door is a kosher deli. He doesn't like that food. But for some reason, he stops and he says to himself, kosher food, it's a Jewish obligation. Unkosher food desensitizes you spiritually. Stands there shaking and sweating and agonizing over the question for half an hour and eats a kosher lunch. Tremendous growth. A value has overcome a temptation. The next day, the battle doesn't last as long. And 3 or 4 days later, finds himself eating kosher food out of habit. No more reward. No more battle. When you're beating the guys in your club easily and you're playing the international people, there's no more ordeal at the lower level. You've outgrown that. Your muscle has strengthened itself, and now you're dealing with more mighty opponents. You're a more mighty warrior, but you're dealing with more mighty opponents. And therefore, that is the teaching of the point of free will. And when you're an educator, by the way, when you're a teacher or a parent, you need to know where your child is operating before you stress them against their own level. No good holding them all to the same standard. You need to know where your child's strength and weakness. And are you stressing them and drawing them up in terms of their own capacity at their level? That's genuine growth. And that, of course, will take us into a discussion of human uniqueness and how you define what your own role is in your own strengths. That's a discussion for another time. You'll have to invite me some other time, Rabbi Jack, and I'll be happy to do that. Now, let's take the next step. Why is that young man's freedom mugging people on the street and your freedom an extra kind word to your wife when you're feeling stressed and just making that little extra effort of another, right? Why? And here comes a very important principle. The answer is it may not be his fault. That young man on the street mugging little old ladies, that may not be his fault, but it's somebody's fault. Listen carefully, this is very scary. Let's say that young fellow was brought up, he was raised in that situation. No fault of his own. So he is dealing with how cruel he will be when he mugs his next victim. The fact that he's mugging victims on the street altogether is not his problem, not his fault. Whose problem is it? His parents, his grandparents, Social Security, United States government, God's. I don't know. In other words, where you start in life, your starting point of freedom is not your fault. You are born with certain givens of intellect, looks, money, background, all sorts of stuff that you did not choose. That's not your fault. Listen carefully. This is such an important principle. When kids apportion blame, it's not my fault. I have a learning difficulty. Listen well. The correct answer is your learning difficulty is not your fault at all, but how you cope with it is. What you're given as the raw material in your life is not your fault. That's God's fault. But how you deal with it, all he's testing you, all he's asking you for is how you handle the situation you find yourself in. Now, let's take this further. It's an amazing concept. When you do something that affects other people, you walk into your place of work in the morning and your colleague walks past, and this colleague leads a kind word, a vulnerable, and you're a little careless and a little insensitive and you don't greet them. And they have a bad day because of that. They lose confidence, they get depressed, they do bad stuff. The bad stuff leads to other bad stuff, and it amplifies itself throughout the world. It's your problem, all of it, because it's all a consequence of something that you did. Scary stuff, huh? Let me give you an example. On Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur every year, I mean, once we're frightening ourselves, we might as well terrify ourselves. So let me tell you like it is. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur every year, the books of the living and the dead are opened. Everyone's judged. All souls are judged. Okay, even the spiritual black belts in Houston. Everybody's judged spiritually on Rosh Hashanah. Living and dead. Now, the Kabbalists ask an obvious question. Why would God judge the souls of the dead every year? They can't be any different than they were the year before. Why does God reopen the book on everybody who's been dead for years? Death means you cannot make a movement up or down. You have no free will left when you died. All you can do is coast with the momentum that you built up in life. So here's a person, they die. God judges them, whatever that means. Next year judges them again. Next year again. Why? By definition, you cannot be any different a year later than you were the year before, because you've got no merits or demerits, no mitzvahs and no averos. Why would he need to judge a soul every year? And the answer is amazing. The answer is this. The reason God judges a soul at the end of a year when they've been dead is because during this year, while they've been in the higher world, during this year, many things have happened in the world that are the consequences of something they did back when they were alive, that are only now playing themselves out to the credit. But here's a person who had a child and then they died. But the child had children and the children had children. Now there's 3,768 great-grandchildren in the world. And all that all of them are doing is accruing to the credit of the person who began that process, because it's all an output of their spiritual momentum in the world, to the extent, of course, that the children are continuing mindlessly what the parent taught. That means when you do something in the world, because your parents taught you, it's not your credit, it's theirs. To get credit, you've got to increase. You've got to change. You've got to go beyond what it was that you were given. And when you do damage in the world because it's your parents' fault, because that's their problem, not yours. Is this clear? This is an amazing thing to understand. And therefore, by the way, you have to think this way. When you make an effort in the world, choose an effort that will have repercussions. I'll give you an example. I know of a family many, many years ago in Israel that saved up $30,000 of their charity money. And they decided to do the following thing with their money. You know, the Chofetz Chaim says you should give away 10% of your after-tax income, but some of it you should make into a loan fund. Not give away, but loan, so you can constantly use the same money again. Listen to what this family did. They took $30,000. In those days, it was enough to put a down payment on an apartment in Jerusalem. They found a young couple getting married who could not afford an apartment. And they said to this young couple, we are presenting you with $30,000 down payment on an apartment. You'll get a mortgage, you'll have a home. But this is not a gift, it's a loan. But it's a loan with an interesting condition. When you accrue enough money over the years, you pay it back, but not to us. You find another young couple getting married and you loan it to them with the same condition. And a number of families have now bought homes. That's what you call bang for the buck. That's what you call using your head. Because you put something into motion that has, okay, somebody says it sounds like you're promoting blaming parents for our faults. Indeed, absolutely. You and your parents, when your parents put something into you, that's their fault. That you're abused or disadvantaged or harmed in some way. Of course it's their fault. But your test is what you do with that situation. That's not their fault. Understand very carefully. Very, very important to understand this. Let me give you another example. I'll tell you a story where you see somebody does something and you see the consequences playing themselves out so clearly. And I'm telling you a first-hand story. I know this person. I met a Hasidic Jew from Brooklyn when he came to South Africa to buy diamonds. This man's name's Laser Wolf. I'm telling you a personal story. This man's mother was pregnant in the Warsaw Ghetto just before the Germans killed everybody. She needed to see a doctor and she managed to escape from the ghetto. And she went to see a lady doctor, a Christian woman, a Catholic woman from the old Polish aristocracy in the city of Warsaw. This non-Jewish doctor, this Christian lady, treated the Jewish patient. And when the Jewish woman was about to leave the office, the doctor said to her, if you go back into the ghetto, you know what's going to happen to you? The Germans were closing in. She said, yes, I know. So the doctor said, come and stay with me. So the lady went back into the ghetto and told her husband that this Christian woman was offering to save their lives. So the husband said, because she said to the doctor, I can't leave my husband. She said, bring him as well. When she told her husband, the husband said, but I can't leave my family. So they brought him as well. Her family and his family. They arrived at this doctor's house with 13 people. And she put them in the attic of her home for 22 months, including a time during which Gestapo occupied the house. They never left that attic once in 22 months. And every day she kept them clean, carried away their waste with her own hands. There was no bathroom and no water. She kept them fed and cleaned every single day for 22 months, and all 13 survived. Amazing things happened, but they all 13 survived. After 22 months, she managed to get them across the Swiss border, and all 13 survived, and all 13 made it to New York City. About 15 years ago in New York, there was a wedding of one of the grandchildren of one of those 13 people, and at that wedding, there were 200 people present, descended from the 13 people that she saved 80 years before, and they went back to Poland and they found her. And they brought her to be present, an old lady, to sit at a Jewish wedding in Brooklyn, see 200 people dancing around her, children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and during the meal, someone walked up to her and said to her, why did you risk your life to save Jews? And she drew herself up and she said, because I read the Bible. And I saw in Genesis that God was threatening to wipe out the city of Sodom, and Abraham negotiated with God. And he said to God, if you can find 50 righteous people, you save the city. And God said yes. 45 righteous people, and God said yes. And she said, I was hoping that there'd be enough of us to save Poland. And I was wrong. She died about 3 years ago, this lady, by the way. Now, those children are all her children. And the grandchildren are all hers. You do an action in the world, and it ripples on and on and on. It's yours. So you raise a child with certain moral values, and the kid raises his kids with the same values. It's your credit, not theirs. And if you abuse a child, you know, here's a child raised in a Jewish home. Every morning, the kid eats a kosher breakfast. Does he get any reward for that? No, he's doing that automatically. Who's getting the reward? Some grandparent who sacrificed mightily to bring up a family with those values that they're now propagating automatically. You want a spiritual reward in the world? You've got to go beyond what your parents gave you. You can't ride on the credit of what you think you're going to get credit for what they put into the world with their effort. Okay. Now, so far so good? Yes, no? Robert, you with me? Let us take one more step. Let us take one more step. This flies in the face of modern psychological teaching. Because modern psychology is, well, it's not my fault. It's genes and environment and chemistry and enzymes and parents and all that stuff. Not my fault. Listen carefully, that's mistaken. Let me put the problem to you as clearly as I can. I'll give you two examples to make it clear. Here's two examples. Number one, I have a friend who's a psychiatrist. Some time ago, he said to me, he wants to discuss one of his patients with me. Sure, absolutely. Why you want to talk to me? I'm not a psychiatrist. Here's the problem. He's got a 21-year-old Jewish girl who steals candy in the supermarket. That's her problem. She's fine in every other way. She's a rich kid. She's got a house full of candy. She gets a tremendous pleasure. She has tremendous compulsion to steal candy in the supermarket. The problem, she's now in court for the 10th time. And the judge is asking my friend to testify because he's a psychiatrist. If it tells the judge that she's psychotically deranged, she will go for psychiatric treatment. If it tells the judge that she's sane, legally sane, she'll go to jail. This is a 10th offense, and she may die there. You're talking about a naive, sweet, innocent girl in a South African jail. Very dangerous. And my friend says, what am I going to tell the judge? I cannot tell the judge she's insane. She doesn't fit the legal definition of insanity. She knows what she's doing. She tries to control herself. She comes for therapy. What am I going to say? Now, ladies and gentlemen, listen carefully. If you say that the girl is not legally responsible because she has no free will, because she has compulsions, well, then everyone can claim compulsions. You know, if you see me with one of my problems, I mean, I don't steal candy in the supermarket. I got other issues. But, you know, if you find me with one of my issues, I don't know, chocolate cake, and you say, Tatz, look, you're out of control with chocolate cake. I say, hey, you don't understand my compulsions. It's not me, it's my genes and my enzymes and my chemistry and my leptins and my this and my that. It's what my mother did when I was 3, my father did when I was 4. Well, here's the question, and this is a hot topic in societal debate today. Do we say the girl is exempt because of her compulsions? Now, whether kleptomania is genetic or that's not the point for now. And it's a florid example of compulsions. But or do we say she's 100% accountable? Whichever way you go, you're in trouble. If you say she's not accountable because of her compulsions, then who's accountable for anything? And if you say, right, she's 100% accountable, her compulsions are irrelevant, that's dumb. Obviously, they're relevant. The reason that you guys in Houston don't hang out in the supermarket stealing candy is because you don't have those compulsions. So how do we handle this? Which position do we take in Judaism? Let me give you another example. There was a celebrated case in New York. I don't want to go into the history because it's a very vexed history, but just to take an example. A young lady was jogging through Central Park. If you're old enough, you'll remember this case. 4 or 5 young men from the Harlem ghetto attacked her. Do you remember this case? At least that was the accusation. They broke every bone in her body. It was a Sunday afternoon. When the police picked them up, they never stole anything. When the police picked them up, they told the police they did it for fun. Sunday afternoon, they did it for fun. Okay. The case came to trial in New York, and the defense raised a novel defense. The defense said these young men should be acquitted because they were raised in the Harlem ghetto. They were so beaten and abandoned and brutalized and poverty-stricken with no educational role models. They had such social disadvantages that what they did was in keeping with their sociological background, and you cannot hold, actually, technically, I'm sure we got some lawyers in this group. Technically, what happened was the lawyers tried to invalidate the jury members. They said, you middle-class whites cannot sit in judgment on these people. You cannot relate to their situation. Now let's just think about that for a moment. Do we say that that claim is true? These young men are totally exonerated. They were raised in violence, and therefore what they did is, but if you say that, then there's no accountability for crime at all. Because every criminal will say, I'm a function of my genes and my background and my sociological influences. And if you take the opposite view and you say they're 100% guilty and the violent background is irrelevant, that's dumb. Obviously, it's relevant. The reason that you people in Houston don't hang out in the park on Sunday afternoons beating up girls with a piece of lead piping. You'd be sick at the thought you weren't raised that way. Gentlemen and ladies, here's the moral dilemma. Does Judaism accept coercive psychological variables like sociological influences and genes and chemistry, or don't we? Which way do we go? Whichever way you go, you're in trouble. Do we see the problem? Okay, listen carefully. Here's the Jewish answer, and this is what you need to take away, and this is the way you need to poise your educational philosophy. According to Judaism, all those psychological coercive factors are 100% relevant. The genes and the chemistry and the influences and the movies and all that stuff is 100% relevant. Do you know what that stuff does? It sets the point of freedom. But what you do at your point of freedom is up to you. When the girl walks into the store and sees the candy and has a compulsion, that's not her fault. That's kleptomania. But whether she takes the candy or doesn't take it, that's up to her. Assuming she has the free will to make that choice. When the young men stand in the park and they see the girl jogging, one fellow says to the other one, hey, dude, or whatever they say, let's go beat up that guy. The guy says, yeah, man. Is that their fault? No. That's how you think when you're raised in those desperate circumstances. But when they walk over and beat her up, and no, they wouldn't like to have their own bones broken, they're guilty. Less guilty than you would be, by the way. Less guilty than you would be. and more meritorious when they overcome it, because the proportions of their battle are different than yours. So the Jewish answer is, when that kid tells you, it's not my fault, I was born with a learning difficulty, with this, with that, the other. And by the way, the gifted child should not be made to feel superior. You were born with the gifts. Jewish parents, you should say to your kid, the reason you got intelligent genes is because of us. That's where you got it from. You got it from us. That's correct. But the question is, what do you do with it? That's what God's looking at. He's not looking at the gifts he gave you. He's looking at what you do with those gifts. And therefore, modern psychology, Tabitha, I'm glad you approve. I'm glad you agree with me. Excellent. And therefore, the Jewish teaching is that you can blame your parents and your peers and the Social Security and the United States government and God for a lot of stuff. But you can't blame him for what you do with the stuff that you give him. Okay, that's the concept. Okay, look, there's a lot to talk about here. Let me stop in case you have any questions. If I can, I'm very happy to answer if I can. Oh, so someone's asking about the recent ruling in France about a person claiming moral irresponsibility because he was high. This is a very difficult legal question. I'll only say one thing about it, and that is, see, the question here is if a person is beyond the point of free will because of some chemical agent, then he's not accountable for his action at that time. But is he accountable for putting himself in a situation where he'll become dangerous, which is a one step removed, is a very interesting legal question. I'll just say this, in Judaism, there is a recognition of a compartmentalized psychotic state. In other words, it's well known, and I'm sure Dr. Wiener, even though this is not his field, possibly directly, but you come across people who are totally in touch with the reality across the board. They've got one fixed area of delusional activity in which they're very logical in their own terms, by the way, usually, but they're out of touch with the reality in that area. In Jewish law in general, the person's held accountable in other areas and not in that area. I'll just give you one more example, which is fascinating. There's a thing in United States law which originates in Old English law, which is called the Mcnaughton Rules. This fascinating thing, I wrote about this in my free will book. The lawyers among you will know this. The Mcnaughton Rules state, listen carefully, it's amazing, that if a person claims that they committed a murder because they heard delusional voices telling them to do it, and the court accepts that they're totally psychotically deluded, they can be held 100% accountable for murder. Again, let me say that again. According to the Mcnaughton Rules in British and American law, a person can be held accountable for murder even if they're floridly psychotic and they did the murder only because they heard voices telling them. The reason is the court says to them, why did you listen to the voices? If you came to court and claimed that some human told you to do it, that would not be exonerating. If you claim that delusional voices told you to do it, but you knew it was wrong, that is no defense. There are psychotic defenses. You felt it was self-defense. There are defenses. But the defense that you did it because a delusional voice told you, according to, very interesting, and Judaism would agree with that. Now, Susan is asking a question. Susan, what question do you ask? Oh, you're asking about whether God knows beforehand. Is that your question, Susan? Okay, is a question here that God knows what choices you will make before you make them. With your permission, I'm not going to go into that. If you think today's subject is difficult, wait till we get to that one. That's the classic problem of Yedir and Bechira. God knows beforehand what you're going to choose, and yet you have free will. That is a lengthy chapter in my book. And I would say if you want to understand it very well, then you need to buy 2 copies. But if you email me, I'll be very... Is ADHD a legitimate excuse? The rabbi is asking. And the question is, excuse for what? It's a legitimate excuse for claiming that you're at a particular position on the free will spectrum. Absolutely. Yes, indeed. And therefore, you should be judged in terms of that issue. Absolutely. And of course, you're held accountable for maximizing your potential. Maybe a drug would help you. You're accountable if you don't take it. So it's not an excuse. It's a correct attribution. If you have a diagnosis, and the diagnosis can be a hardcore psychological diagnosis, or it can be a soft-core emotional situation, that not only an excuse, that is who you are. Now the question is, how are you functioning at your level of raw material, psychological, spiritual, emotional raw material that you've been given? Let me tell you something, this is very empowering. When you tell a child it's not your fault that you have this ability or that disability, that's not your fault. It's a gift you were given or a handicap you were given. But what we're looking from you is how you accomplish and what you achieve in those circumstances. And when you're dealing with people in psychotherapy, it's very empowering. The person has an addictive personality. You need to give them all the support of knowing that it's not their fault. But buddy, how are you handling that? Are you maximizing you're taking your circumstances, and given that this is your circumstance in your situation, what are you doing with this constellation of variables that comprise who you are? That's important. It's very empowering. On the contrary, you turn a disadvantage into something very empowering. This is a circumstance you're given. You have no choice about the color of your skin or your religion or your race or your intellect or your gifts. Okay, that's the package you've been given. Can you bring that to a maximum? Can you maximize that package? That's how you'll be judged. The Rambam writes that you can be as great as Moses. What does he mean? If you achieve 99% of your potential, like he achieved 99% of his, you'll stand next to him in the next world. What more can God ask from you? Okay, are you required to take medicine for ADHD? The answer is, if there's a medication that can help you in any medical psychological situation and is correctly indicated medically, you're obliged. The Rambam says, listen to this, Rabbi Jackman. The Rambam says, anybody who refuses a medication that he requires is as foolish as somebody saying, I won't eat and God will keep me alive. That's what he writes. And the Rambam was a doctor. He says medications are natural creations like foodies, and God put them in the world for your use. By the way, he was talking in an era where virtually all medications were natural products anyway. Today, by the way, there still are most of them that just happen to be synthesized. But the vast majority of classical medications came from the plant world. And the Rambam writes they were put into the world like food was. And if you say God will keep me alive if I don't eat, that's exactly the same as I'm not going to take the medicine, I'll be okay when you need it. Of course, any sensible medical professional will tell you if you can get away without medication, it's much better. But if you need it, of course, absolutely. Okay, how do you know what level you're at, Laurie's asking. Great question. Great question. And I hate to tell you this, Laurie. Your capacities are so far above what you think they are that it's just not true. Where you think you're holding is nothing compared to what you're capable of. And therefore, don't take a chance. Assume you're a Superman or a Superwoman. Okay, this the first step of spiritual development is to know who you are, to see things objectively and to know who you really are. Not easy, but that's the first step, unless you see things objectively. I hate to say this, but we live in a world today where truth is no longer a value. Truth is no longer a value. I don't mean to be personal about this with Americans, but you live in a world where American leadership, and as that is true in the West in general, you can say anything. You don't have to be not beholden to the truth at all these days. You can say whatever you want, make any claims you want, and it's all cool. No, the Jewish process begins with learning to be objective and to see things as they are. Anyone from Dallas or San Antonio? Yeah, I'm not prejudiced against them. If anyone has a question there, I'm happy to answer. Oh, great question. Yehudit is asking this. If you overcame issues that you had in childhood, are the deceased parents judged more favorably? This is an amazing question. Try to explain.
It's so bad. No, why are you working so hard on me?
Let me try to answer this question. It's a complex question, but I'll just deal with it briefly. What accountability do parents have for what children achieve? The deep answer to this question, again, I can't deal with this fully, but the deep answer is, what is the parent's genuine accountability? Let me just give you an example to illustrate. I was raised in South Africa, as you heard. I come from a South African Jewish community, which is extremely traditional, extremely. Virtually everybody there calls themselves Orthodox. There's no conservative movement at all. Everyone's nominally Orthodox. Not everyone practices full Orthodoxy, but that's the standard. That's the standard. Very, very old-fashioned. And Mandy, I'm glad you. I feel the same way. So let me say this: some of my contemporaries who became very religiously knowledgeable, went off to yeshiva and studied, sometimes looked down on their parents. You know why? Because knowledgeable person studied Torah and achieved some accomplishments. And you irreligious Jews, the irony is many of those religious kids owe their total self-development in their religion to their non-religious parents. You know why? Because those parents weren't religious, but boy, did they teach integrity. And they taught sacrificing for your Jewish values. And they sacrificed for kids' Jewish education. And they taught them to be a mensch. All the basic values were put in. Now this kid goes ahead and thinks they're a big deal religiously. The values came from the parents. And therefore, you can't judge superficially. You need to look to the real cause, the real underlying energies. And therefore, okay, so not looking superficially. How much do you owe to a teacher, a parent, someone who inspired you? You give credit. That's where it was. You take credit for increasing, going beyond that, amplifying it. Okay. Or if a parent taught you negatively and you overcame that and became positive, So you could wrench yourself out of that, and that's a secret merit for parents going back someplace. Okay, any other questions before we close? There's nothing I can say about the tragedy. We referred to it earlier. These are things beyond human understanding. We have a general principle in Judaism that without prophecy, we don't know why things happen. Again, it's too painful to go into in specifics. Things happen for a reason, and one day we'll understand. But we have a deep principle that since the prophetic era is no longer with us, we no longer know why particular, and anybody tell you this happened because of this, people did this wrong, therefore that happened, is irresponsible and unnecessarily cruel. We don't know. We don't know why things happen, and doesn't justify any responsibility and plans that should have been made and plans that need to be made. But we cannot know why some situations merit certain kinds of protections and others don't. We don't know that. This is a separate subject to analyze fully, but I want to know how religious. I also want to know that, Mandy. Indeed, I would also like to know that. Yes. No answer to that. Anyone else with any other further points? Now I'm happy to speak for 3 more minutes and close the circle, unless you all too. Oh, okay. Good question. What happened to the girl who stole the candy? Okay, maybe let's finish with that. What happened to the girl who stole the candy? Okay, so here's one more element which I hope you'll enjoy. My friend told the judge. Now, my friend, the psychiatrist, is a religious Jew, and he knew the principle that he should operate with. And here's what he told the judge. He said, Your Honor, sending this girl to jail is not the correct solution. That's not going to solve the problem. But she's the 10th offense. We need to ensure she doesn't do this again. I will take full responsibility that she doesn't do this again. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take her around to the manager of every supermarket in her area and introduce her personally to the manager. Mr. Manager, see this girl? She steals candy. Now she knows she's being watched. She can't do it again. Now let me explain what the sense is here. The Talmud says that, listen carefully, this is an amazing secret. The way to use your free will is not to use it. Sacrifice it. Put yourself in a situation where you could not choose wrongly. The reward you get for that choice is far greater. Listen carefully. When you put yourself into an illicit situation and you overcome the temptation, you shouldn't have been there. I'll give you a classic example in Judaism. In Jewish law, a man and a woman may not be a man and a woman who have a forbidden relationship. It's an adulterous type of relationship. They are forbidden to be in seclusion together. In seclusion together. You know why? Because a man and a woman in seclusion, under certain circumstances, relationships tend to happen. And therefore, there's a Jewish law. You're not allowed to be there in the first place. If you get into a situation like that and nothing happens, you're guilty. Why? Because you put yourself in a situation of temptation is a misuse of free will. The correct use of free will is to stay out of trouble. There's no challenge to that? Cool. Don't ask for challenges. Let me explain to you like this. The Talmud says, here's a man he's going home, this man, traveling down the road. Comes to a fork in the road. I'll finish with this. A man comes to a fork in the road, and he has 2 options. He can take a safe road home, or another road where there are women doing some washing in the river. They're not modestly covered, and if he looks at these women, it's a breach of Jewish modesty. He should not be looking at things like that. So the man says to himself, which road shall I take? If I take the safe road, I just get home. Let me take the road where the women are and not look. The Talmud says, if he takes the road where the ladies are and does not look, he failed. He's an evil man. You know why? Because the test was not will you look or not. The test was which road will you take. You see, this man wasn't looking for moral. This man was looking for drama. It doesn't say in the Torah, thou shalt be dramatic. There's a man walking down the road. There are 2 roads. One is a poisonous cobra poised to strike. One is safe. You take the road with a snake. Let's see if I can duck and dodge. Idiot! You got a bottle of poison at home. Let's put it on the table next to the wine to see if we can drink it. Yeah, idiot, what are you doing? You lock it up. Anybody who wades into moral danger thinking they'll overcome it, even if you overcome it, you failed. The correct use of free will, next time you buy a home in Houston, you buy a home next to Rabbi Jacqueline. You know why? Because you'll be too ashamed to walk around in your underwear. The rabbi might walk in. Put yourself in a situation and make sure your children do not get into bad company. When your kids are playing with other kids who are vulgar or into drugs or whatever it is, and your kid has to hold strong, they shouldn't be in that situation. Put yourself in a situation that lifts you morally, where your choices are a whole different range of choices. Put yourself in, next time a young person choosing a job, Are you going to go for the glitzy and glamorous job where they pay you well, which is morally compromising? Or you're going to go for the less glamorous and glitzy job that is morally safe? Those are the big life decisions. They may not seem dramatic, but those are the big decisions in life. If you go for the immoral option and you fight and win every moral battle, you shouldn't have been there. And therefore, the highest level of free will is to sacrifice it. And what we call that humility. When you put yourself into a situation where you sacrifice your free will, because when you want to assert your free will, you want to show what a big deal you are. In Kabbalistic teaching, that was Adam's mistake. God said to him, he didn't ask him to do something, God asked him not to. God said, I'm asking you one thing, just don't interfere. Don't go near, don't eat the fruit of that tree. And man said, you mean you gave me all this power not to use? And God said, yeah, I want you to make yourself transparent. I want you to admit that it's me, I'm the reality. Let me shine through you. And Adam said, no, I want to show you how much I love you. And the only mistake was, instead of saying, I want to show you how much I love you, he said, I want to show you how much that's all, love you, that's all. So he wanted to show his free will and his capacity. That's ego, that's where you lose it. Okay, Rabbi Jackman, thank you very much for this opportunity. Dr. Wiener, nice to see you again.
Wow. Rabbi Tatz, thank you so much. And before we close, I just want to really thank once again my partners, Rabbi Zakon and Rabbi Nissel from Adhd of Plano. Thank you for inviting your wonderful friends and family from Dallas, and Rabbi Abrams from the Jewish Learning Center, also in Dallas, and Rabbi Scheinberg from Congregation of Lord Shalom in San Antonio, and of course all the Houstonians and the Bella Jewish Center. So thank you, and once again our sponsors, Dr. Howard and Barbara Weiner, Houston Jewish Funerals, Eric and Sarah Gibbs, and this whole cheer was again for Refuah Shlema for Gershon Ben Sipora. You should have Refuah Shlema. So really thank you, Rabbi Tatz. And if we had Rabbi Tatz in Houston and Dallas and San Antonio, I think we'd be a better community. What do you guys think, huh? We need Rabbi Tatz in person. Dr. Weiner, what do you think?
Listen, if I come, I'll come there if next time you give me a pair of boots with the spurs or that cowboy hat, something like that. That'll do it. That'll do it.
That's easy.
Anyway,
easy.
Regards to Rabbi Zakon and the other rabbis, and to Gershon and anyone else that's an old friend, thank you very much for this invitation. I wish you a wonderful day. Mitzvah Shem, we should move into a period of time now where the din is mitigated. We've suffered enough. And in the merit of the wonderful work you do there in the Jewish community, can only hope that that'll lift us. Thank you very much.